Welcome to the second review of early American history. This time we'll be focusing on the Revolutionary War and the beginnings of the early American Republic. Towards the end of what we call the colonial period, England had been steadily trying to make its empire more profitable. And throughout the 17th century, they passed a series of navigation acts to regulate trade with the colonies. And in attempting to make more money, they're also increasingly going to be in conflict with the French. There's quite a bit of war with France as well as other European countries after 1694. And in the sort of course of pursuing these conflicts, England's goal is to make lots of money and defeat its European rivals. So the French and Indian War is nothing really new. 1754 rolls around. This rivalry between England and France had already been there for quite some time. And as it develops into a full-blown war, it involves the French, the native peoples, particularly the native peoples of this area up here, and the American colonists. In defeating France, England does gain all of this territory here, but expanding their control over that territory, as well as just the cost of the war, puts England in quite a bit of debt. That debt is going to trigger the process of setting the United States, these colonies, free from Mother England. So part of England's drive to regulate its empire, to make its empire profitable, led them to close off access to these lands that were controlled by France because of the expense of defending them. As colonial settlers go west, as land speculators cross over, and there's increasing contact with native peoples get frustrated. It's not good to wake up one day and find a white man in your garden telling you that he's bought this property or he's just here to take it. So there's actually a conflict that breaks out, Pontiac's War in 1763, and the British don't want to just pour more money into defending this area because it's already been an expensive war. So their thought process is, let's limit access to the West and then squeeze money out of these folks who, because of their activities, have led to costly and devastating conflicts. So the Proclamation of 1763 is going to be one of the first acts of the British after the French and Indian War that will anger the Americans. Since crossing over into the west, past the Appalachian Mountains, it's just too costly for the British to protect. So no colonists, you can't go there. A second conflict that will erupt between Britain and its colonies is going to be the Stamp Act. As the British are trying to squeeze money from the colonies to pay for these war debts and the defense of its empire, they come up with a tax that is quite new in the design of it. Before, the British had roughly been profitable just trading with the Americans. So they had hidden the cost of doing business in the Navigation Acts, which were taxes built into the prices of goods, duties that you would pay for shipping your products to England or from wherever you happen to be sending them. These hidden costs, the colonists had largely escaped, sometimes through smuggling, and therefore they'd kind of gotten used to not really paying taxes in the first place. Secondly, what's different about the Stamp Act versus these other taxes hidden in the cost of doing business is that the Stamp Act is a direct tax on legal documents and paper usage. When the colonists are used to interacting with England, none of the taxes are direct. It's not an in-your-face kind of tax. But the Stamp Act is one of those kind of in-your-face taxes that angers the colonists because they're so used to not paying taxes to begin with, or not very many. In fact, taxes are a lot higher in England. But they also are used to making their own taxes through their legislative assemblies. So the Stamp Act is not greeted with a great deal of joy. You can see here from this little piece of art that showed up in a Pennsylvania newspaper that the colonists are quite angry over being taxed. And they say that it's not fair to tax them because they've been taxed without being represented in Parliament. It's one thing to tax trade, hide the tax and the cost of doing business. It's another thing to say that you have to pay a tax on paper that might be used to write a will, print a newspaper, whatever you would need paper for. The British then later extend taxes into other goods, so tea and sugar as well, and these attempts at collecting money are only going to just anger the colonists further and further until we get closer and closer to an actual break with England. One of the ways that colonists rejected these new taxes was to be violent. So under the Stamp Act, they intimidated stamp distributors. They gathered in mobs in the streets. They also employed nonviolent means, boycotts. So they refused to import British goods. And in so doing, then that's going to cost British merchants money, and the British merchants will then go to Parliament and say, please get rid of this tax. It's costing us business with the colonies. So a combination of street violence as well as a non-importation boycott puts the pressure on the British. And we end up in a cycle of the British tax, the colonists pitch a fit, the British repeal the tax. The British come out with a new tax, the colonists pitch a fit, the British repeal. And this cycle goes on from 1765 right up until 1773. There is a small violent incident in the colonies in 1770, the Boston Massacre. British troops fire on anti-British demonstrators who actually started it, throwing snowballs and rocks. But the incident doesn't really generate enough discontent to actually start a war yet. And I think it's important to think about that because in the whole process of the colonies rejecting British taxing, they never reject being British. In fact, they frame all of their arguments as, we're British, you can't do this taxation to us because we're British. Their identity is very strongly pro-England. They just don't want to pay these taxes because they don't think it's in accordance with their rights as British citizens. And they're so used to imitating British culture and British traditions, a process we call Anglicization, that they can't imagine a revolution for independence yet. It's going to take a long time for that to happen. One of the key flashpoints in that transition will be the Boston Tea Party. A Tea Act will attempt to get the colonists to be okay with paying taxes. It actually lowers the cost of tea, the tea tax, in an attempt to get the colonists to go, well, cheap tea, I'll buy it. So the colonists smell a trap, and they stage the Boston Tea Party to dump the tea into Boston Harbor in December of 1773. The British then respond with punishment of the Americans, the so-called coercive acts or intolerable acts. And as they do so, the Americans are starting to think about what their next steps are. What's guiding their thinking, their intellectualization of the problems they're experiencing with Britain, is the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thought emphasized natural rights, John Locke, life, liberty, and property, and political authority derived from the people. You know, consent of the governed is a key idea for the Americans. No taxation without representation. Rights being spelled out in law and respected. The Enlightenment also emphasized reason over religion. So these rights could be traced to principles that were embedded in the fabric of human existence. That you did not need to look to God directly through your king for protection for your rights. They're self-evident everywhere in all of nature, in all of creation. They're embedded in the world that these rights exist, and no one can take them away. And if they do, you have a right to revolt against those who are taking your freedoms. John Locke is one of the key thinkers in this revolutionary process. So he's a 17th century political figure involved actually in the founding of North and South Carolina. He writes the constitutions, the first constitutions for it. His thinking evolves in the context of the English experience with the Glorious Revolution of 1789. So he talks a lot about the right of the people to overthrow a government that does not respect their rights and their freedoms. And especially when that government takes away natural rights of life, liberty, and property, rights that rulers should not take away or attempt to take away. John Locke helps the colonists understand that all the power of government resides with the people. The people are sovereign. And when they want to form a government, they come together and enter into a social contract, an idea that we can trace to Rousseau, even more so than Locke. People form a government to protect their rights, and that government's duty is to make sure that life, liberty, and property are protected. In return for the social contract being created, people obey the laws and the rules established by their government, and when that government is abusive of their rights, then the people can overthrow it. All of these ideas are going to show up eventually in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the whole beginning of which is almost exclusively plagiarized from John Locke. In America, as Americans are debating, their next steps, should we be independent? Should we not? Should we just continue to insist that we're British and the British should respect our freedoms? A British migrant comes to enter the conversation. His name is Tom Paine. He writes a pamphlet, a very short pamphlet, called Common Sense in 1776, early 1776. And he challenges the idea that the colonists can stay connected to Britain. He mocks the idea that the British government is actually a good government. He criticizes the monarchy as a ridiculous form of government. He argues that England cannot govern the colonies. What business does a tiny island thousands of miles away have with regulating the huge American colonies? And so he makes a number of very crystal clear arguments for independence, convincing people that, it's time. We should break away because we've tried to maintain our rights as British citizens within the system, but the system is never going to protect them. The Declaration of Independence of July 1776 will then recognize the influence of Paine and Locke in its opening of "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Notice the switch from property to pursuit of happiness there at the end. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the government. Look at all that lock-in language. And that when a form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, which is exactly what Locke had been saying. You know, the British system's not going to work. Break away. So by 1776, the colonists had moved to the position of independence, but it did not mean that they were automatically united. There were differences between them. Some people really wanted to be free and independent. We call them the Patriots or the Whigs. Their belief in complete independence, their reliance on Locke and Paine, will lead them to join the American Army led by George Washington, or to fight within their states, now states instead of colonies, for freedom. But about 1/5 of all Americans remain loyal. These people, the Loyalists or the Tories, are tied to Britain because of cultural and economic ties. Many of them are royal officials, or they make their money in trade with Britain, or they're deeply committed to the Anglican Church. And they do not feel like independence is a good idea. They think that Britain does have a right to govern them. They also think that it makes no sense to be independent, and they're afraid that being independent will actually hurt America more than help. About 1/3 of folks, 1/4 to 1/3, remain neutral. That is, not pick a side because they weren't sure who was going to win, and it kind of made sense to say, I'm just going to wait this thing out and see what happens. Perhaps, maybe, you know, I'll survive this whole conflict, and then I can cheerfully join whoever is the winning team. Ultimately, the United States won for several reasons. Even though the British had a very strong army and navy, Americans had the home court advantage. Never underestimate that. George Washington would systematically avoid situations that threatened the destruction of his entire army, so he knew when to fight and he knew when to run. We cannot also downplay diplomatic help, foreign help. After the Battle of Saratoga, the French agree to help the United States, and they sign a treaty of alliance with the U.S. So the French help with military support as well as monetary support. The United States gets loans from the Dutch. And so with the French and Dutch help, Americans eventually outlast the British, and at the Battle of Yorktown, they win independence and become their own country. So in the review charts for the origins of the American Revolution, key concepts 3.1 and 3.2, you'll notice there's a chart for causes, and that includes the French and Indian War, which puts England in debt. Debts push the British to reform their empire to regulate the colonies. We also have to look at Enlightenment thought, which we covered in the PowerPoint slides prior to this. So Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Republicanism is something we emphasize in class. Reason's important, good government, rights language, natural rights in particular. Lead the colonists to see a British plot to subvert their liberties. The British plot could be backed up by the acts that the British pass in order to squeeze money out of their colonies or to more tightly regulate their empire, such as the Proclamation of 1763 or the Stamp Act, which I mentioned a few slides back. Other acts that you could use in an AP writing situation would be the Townshend duties, taxes on paper, glass, paint, and tea, and lead. This act, as all the others do, will spur the colonists to not import from Britain. That's their go-to strategy, a boycott. And things really heat up with the Boston Tea Party, which, although lowered taxes in an attempt to get the colonists to accept a tax, the colonists, didn't fall for it, and they destroyed a shipment of tea as an act of protest. The second page of this chart has the intolerable acts, which were not in the lecture slides prior. I mentioned them, but they're not referred anywhere in the lecture slides. These intolerable acts were punishment, and they were not taxes. That's the #1 mistake students make. They are an attempt to beat up Boston and Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. So there's a loss of self-government, closing of the Boston Harbor, a new quartering act, and an act that allows trials of British officials to be moved away from the colonies to places that might be more favorable to the British official. In response, the colonists called the First Continental Congress to work together for a new boycott. But even then, in 1774, they're still asserting their allegiance to Britain. Remember, they're thoroughly steeped in British culture, British ways, British traditions, and they can't see themselves as independent. So the First Continental Congress will say, we're British, we just want to be represented in the empire, not virtually as you say we are, but really represented in the empire. As the situation continues to break down, there's a Second Continental Congress with a last-ditch attempt to reconcile with Britain, and then the colonies begin to write their own constitutions because it becomes clear that independence is the way to go. That idea, argued for by Thomas Paine, though he was able to convince a lot of Americans that independence was the way to go, do recall that about 1/5 of Americans will remain loyal to Britain.